In this lecture, we will focus on the COVID-19 pandemic, framed and analyzed as a global social problem. We will again structure the lecture around two main questions in relation to a host of core readings on the topic. The two questions are, one, how useful is the concept of biopolitics for understanding the social and political dynamics surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic? And two, how should we evaluate the claim that COVID-19 is a plague of capitalism? The core readings which we will review in order to bring these questions into focus include Michel Foucault's classic 1976 lecture at the Collège de France, Society Must Be Defended, in which the eminent social theorist first introduced and analyzed the concept of biopolitics. We will also pay attention to contemporary interpretations of the social dynamics induced by the pandemic that make use of the concept, including not only Giorgio Agamben's rather infamous essay, The Invention of an Epidemic, but also Peter Zendi's more careful Viral Times, as well as Achille Mbembe's most moving and evocative, The Universal Right to Breathe. We will also consider in some detail the arguments about the relationship between the pandemic, global capitalism, and climate catastrophe, advanced by the social historian Mike Davis in The Monster Enters, COVID-19, Avian Nut Flu, and the Plagues of Capitalism, as well as by the always entertaining Slovenian psychoanalytic Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek in his pamphlet, Pandemic, COVID-19 Shakes the World, and by the eminent post-colonial theorist and more recently scholar of climate change, Dipesh Chakrabarty, in an interview he gave back in June on zoonotic pathogens, human life, and pandemic in the age of the Anthropocene. Finally, we will consider as well prominent feminist responses inspired by social reproduction theory and Arendtian political philosophy, respectively, by Alessandra Misadri in her A Crisis Like No Other, Social Reproduction and the Regeneration of Capitalist Life During the Pandemic, and by Rita Gardner and Katie Fulfer in their collaborative essay, Virus Interruptus, an Arendtian exploration of political world building in pandemic times. COVID-19 and the technique of biopolitics. The Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, author of the highly influential multi-volume project Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life, created quite a controversy back in late February when he publicly deplored what he considered, quote, the frantic, irrational, and absolutely unwarranted emergency measures adopted for a supposed epidemic of coronavirus, which he claimed is just another version of the flu, before posing the question, quote, why do the media and the authorities do their utmost to create a climate of panic, thus provoking a true state of exception with severe limitations on movement and the suspension of daily life and work activities for entire regions? He answered most provocatively, it is almost as if with terrorism exhausted as a cause for exceptional measures, the invention of an epidemic offered the ideal pretext for scaling them up beyond any limitation. In other words, for Agamben, the main reason for the allegedly disproportionate response he would locate in the growing tendency to use the state of exception as a normal governing paradigm. The measures imposed in the emergency he denounced are but a conspiracy intended to allow the government to limit seriously our freedoms by executive decree. Agamben's contention that the virus was no more serious than the seasonal flu would be challenged quickly and soon widely considered to have been proven to be false. Nevertheless, the connection he made between biopolitics and government responses to the coronavirus, his political concern about government regulation of public and private life, his articulation of the warning that in the name of public health, restrictions imposed by governments could effectively constitute a further extension of state power, undermining civil liberties, and unlikely to disappear when the pandemic ends, all continue to resonate among important factions on both the right and on the left. Agamben's theoretical framework is heavily indebted to the work of Michel Foucault. Indeed, in his multi-volume magnum opus, Homo Sacer, Agamben centers Foucault's theory of biopolitics, which traces the way in which bare human life became the target of the organizational power of the state. In the process, Agamben attempts to modify Foucault's theory by arguing that there exists a hidden tie between sovereign power and biopolitics, forged in the exceptional basis of state sovereignty. Does Agamben's response to the COVID-19 pandemic reveal a certain paranoia, even irresponsibility, in the mistrust of medicine and science at the root of the Foucauldian paradigm? Or to the contrary, does Agamben's posture provide a perspicacious warning indicative of the urgently continuing contemporary relevance of the Foucauldian biopolitical analytic lens? Let us first consider in more depth Foucault's notion of biopolitics before turning to assess how useful or appropriate the concept is for thinking critically about the social and political dynamics associated with the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. In his famous 1976 lecture, Society Must Be Defended, Foucault draws a contrast between the classical theory of sovereignty and the technique of biopolitics. According to Foucault, in the classical theory of sovereignty, the right of life and death was one of sovereignty's basic attributes. He poses the question, what does having the right of life and death actually mean? To which he answers, in one sense, to say that the sovereign has a right of life and death means that he can basically either have people put to death or let them live, or in any case that life and death are not natural or immediate phenomena which are primal or radical and which fall outside the field of power. In a word, for Foucault, the classical theory of sovereignty entails the right to take life or let live. By contrast, Foucault insists, over the course of the 19th century, a great transformation of political right took place. The old right of sovereignty, to take life or let live, was not altogether replaced. However, it came to be complemented by a new right, which does not erase the old right, but which does penetrate it, permeate it. Foucault contends, quote, this is the right, or rather precisely the opposite right. It is the power to make live and let die. The right of sovereignty was the right to take life or let live. And then this new right is established, to make live and to let die. The superimposition of this new right in the course of the 19th century comes on the heels of the previous introduction and establishment in the course of the 18th century of an anatomopolitics of the human body, primarily concerned with the disciplining of the individual subject. However, Foucault insists, the end of that century would witness the emergence of something that is no longer an anatomopolitics of the human body, but what he calls a biopolitics of the human race. Foucault asks, what does this new technology of power, this biopolitics, this biopower that is beginning to establish itself involve? His answer, it involves a set of processes such as the ratio of birth to death, the rate of reproduction, the fertility of a population, and so on. It is these processes, the birth rate, the mortality rate, longevity, and so on, together with the whole series of related economic and political problems, which in the second half of the 18th century become biopolitics' first object of knowledge and targets it seeks to control. Whereas the anatomopolitics that first emerged in the 18th century was concerned with the disciplining of individual bodies, the biopolitics that emerged towards the end of the 18th century and flourished in the 19th century was concerned with the control of the population as a whole. Things like fertility were its focus, but not only fertility, it also dealt with morbidity. In Foucault's words, the new biopolitics dealt with the problem of morbidity, but not simply, as had previously been the case, at the level of famous epidemics, the threat of which had haunted political powers ever since the early Middle Ages. Foucault remarks, these famous epidemics were temporary disasters that caused multiple deaths, times when everyone seemed to be in danger of imminent death. And he goes on to add, at the end of the 18th century, it was not epidemics that were the issue, but something else, what might broadly be called endemics, or in other words, the form, nature, extension, duration, and intensity of the illnesses prevalent in a population. Foucault explains, these were illnesses that were difficult to eradicate and that were not regarded as epidemics that caused more frequent deaths, but as permanent factors which, and that is how they were dealt with, sapped the population's strength, shortened the working week, wasted energy, and cost money, but both because they led to a fall in production and because treating them was expensive. In a word, he concludes, illness as a phenomenon affecting a population. As Peter Zendy summarizes, Foucault thus introduced a distinction between epidemics and what might broadly be called endemics. And he did so while identifying and relating to each other two technologies of power, which were established at different times and which were superimposed. On the one hand, a disciplinary technology for which the body is individualized. On the other, an insurantial or regulatory technology relating to the biological or biosociological processes characteristic of human masses, That is what he proposes to call a biopolitics of the human race. According to Foucault, biopolitics derives its knowledge from and defines its powers fields of intervention in terms of the birth rate, the mortality rate, various biological disabilities, and the effects of the environment. It deals not with individuals, but with the population as political problem, as a problem that is at once scientific and political, as a biological problem, and as powers problem. As such, in contrast to disciplinary mechanisms, the mechanisms introduced by biopolitics include forecasts, statistical estimates, and overall measures. In a word, security mechanisms have to be installed around the random element inherent in a population of living beings so as to optimize a state of life. And so, as Foucault goes on to explain, beneath that great absolute power, beneath the dramatic and somber absolute power that was the power of sovereignty, and which consisted in the power to take life, we now have the emergence with this technology of biopower, of this technology of power over the population as such, over men insofar as they are living beings. It is continuous, scientific, and it is the power to make live. Sovereignty took life and let live. And now, Foucault contends, we have the emergence of a power that he calls the power of regularization. And it, in contrast, consists in making live and letting die. In this vein, he makes the suggestive remark that power has no control over death, but it can control mortality. And here he hones in on the technical knowledges of medicine and of hygiene, as perhaps uniquely capable of intervening at both the disciplinary and the biopolitical levels. For according to Foucault, you can't understand how and why a technical knowledge such as medicine, or rather the combination of medicine and hygiene, is in the 19th century, if not the most important element, an element of considerable importance because of the link it establishes between scientific knowledge of both biological and organic processes, or in other words, the population and the body. And because at the same time, medicine becomes a political intervention technique with specific power effects. Indeed, he insists, medicine is a power knowledge that can be applied to both the body and the population, both the organism and biological processes, and it will therefore have both disciplinary effects and regulatory effects. Foucault furthermore glimpses the potential for biological warfare, which he conceives as an excess of biopower, and which appears when it becomes technologically and politically possible for man not only to manage life, but to make it proliferate, to create living matter, to build the monster, and ultimately to build viruses that cannot be controlled and that are universally destructive. This formidable extension of biopower, he contends, will put it beyond all human sovereignty. Foucault finally and crucially relates the emergence of the technique of biopower to the rise of state-sponsored racism. The argument is an original and thoughtful one, worth reproducing in some detail. He begins by asking, how can the power of death, the function of death, be exercised in a political system centered upon biopower? To which he answers, it is, I think, at this point that racism intervenes. He is careful to add, however, that, quote, I am certainly not saying that racism was invented at this time. It had already been in existence for a very long time. Nevertheless, he contends, but I think it functioned elsewhere. It is indeed the emergence of this biopower that inscribes it in the mechanisms of the state. It is at this moment that racism is inscribed as the basic mechanism of power, as it is exercised in modern states. From this, he concludes, as a result, the modern state can scarcely function without becoming involved with racism at some point, within certain limits and subject to certain conditions. As if an afterthought, he goes on to ask, what in fact is racism? And to this he answers, it is primarily a way of introducing a break into the domain of life that is under power's control, the break between what must live and what must die. Or to translate into contemporary parlance, racism is a means of deriving which lives matter. In this vein, Foucault emphasizes, that is the first function of racism, to fragment, to create caesuras within the biological continuum addressed by biopower. And he goes on to elaborate further. Racism makes it possible to establish a relationship between my life and the death of the other that is not a military or warlike relationship of confrontation, but a biological type relationship. The more inferior species die out, the more abnormal individuals are eliminated, the fewer degenerates there will be in a species as a whole. And the more I, as species rather than individual, can live, the stronger I will be, the more vigorous I will be. I will be able to proliferate. The fact that the other dies does not mean simply that I live in the sense that his death guarantees my safety. The death of the other, the death of the bad race, of the inferior race, or the degenerate, or the abnormal, is something that will make life in general healthier and purer. In sum, for Foucault, once the state functions in the biopower mode, racism alone can justify the murderous function of the state. We will return to consider this connection between biopolitics and racism in relation to the argument advanced by Achille Mbembe in his essay, The Universal Right to Breathe. We would also suggest that it is well worth remembering this connection when it comes to interpreting racialized inequities in the distribution of COVID-related infection and mortality rates in countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom, about which we will have more to say below. With that, we should take a break.